Yes, okay, thank you very much. I just need to mention, I think, because I forgot, unfortunately, to, in my introduction on the chat forum this morning, I forgot to mention my affiliation with UNISA. Good morning, everyone. I have been asked to present some comments on the recent review undertaken of journals in the disciplines of history, philosophy, and politics, which was published by the Academy in May this year. And I was honored to have been asked by the Academy to act as the chair of the review panel. During this process, 8 history journals, 5 journals located in multidisciplinary fields and in international studies, 4 philosophical journals, 3 journals in political sciences, and 5 journals in security and policing studies were evaluated by the panel. And the panel comprised 8 scholars from various disciplines in the humanities. And the review covered a number of areas which included aspects related to the editorial and business practices, as well as to bibliometric processes. And I would like to mention at this stage that the panel members were extremely grateful for the very efficient assistance lent to us by Ms. Mashia Chidi and Ms. Felsman, who steered us through a very extensive and laborious process. ESCOM permitting, I would now like to use this opportunity to summarize very briefly a few key points emanating from the reviewers' reports and from the panel's consensus reviews. Not, according to the reviewers, not all editorial boards have yet succeeded in establishing racial diversity and gender parity in a manner that could satisfy the ambitions that editors undoubtedly have in this regard. Efforts to attract high-quality contributions from a broader range of national and international institutions and scholars are not always clearly reflected in the published outputs. Some journals were also advised by the reviewers to reconsider the scholarly niche they are trying to occupy in order to avoid overlap with similar journals. In some cases, reviewers argued that the scope and focus of journals could benefit from a more current, a fresher approach to concepts and themes in order to stay relevant. In some instances, there were also comments on long turnaround times and delays in the publication of articles. There were also some comments that were meant to, how can I say, to provide some constructive recommendations for journals. For example, many reviewers recommended the publication of special editions as an appropriate strategy for tightening the focus of journals, as well as to attract more readers. Another comment that we saw quite frequently was that reviewers recommended that editors should be encouraged in the interest of career development of the up-and-coming generation of scholars to accommodate quality papers from young and emerging scholars without compromising a healthy balance with contributions from more senior scholars. As an overall result of the reviewing process, I would like to point out that of the 25 journals that we evaluated, 2 were recommended for removal from the D-head list. 1 journal was conditionally accepted for the D-head list. 4 journals were invited to join Cielo South Africa. 6 journals were not endorsed for inclusion in the Cielo South Africa platform. 9 journals were invited to participate, provided that they implement an open access model. And 6 of the journals that we looked at were already on the Cielo platform. I also would like to briefly make some comments on the constraints for the work of the panel, which was discussed among panel members, constraints that also influence the scope of the reviewing process. The review, as rigorous and extensive as it was, in my opinion, had to rely on the limited time window through which the reviewers and the panel were able to look into the workings of a journal. The period under review extended from 2015 to 2017. And if I remember correctly, the first meeting of the panel took place in February 2018, and obviously it was followed by many more meetings. In the final phase, these meetings were obviously all online. And I think I don't need to belabor the point that the reviewing process is very complex and very time intensive. And I have to confess that the repercussions of a pandemic that erupted last year did not exactly help to speed up the process. So there were some challenges in the process and the organization of the review that the panel tried to navigate. Some of the feedback that we received from journal editors pointed out that some of the comments and recommendations that were made in the reviews had already been addressed after 2017. And some journals were even undergoing a period of transition by establishing new editorial boards or by addressing questions of conceptualizing new identities, new directions for the journal, or by probing shifts in scholarly emphasis. And some editors signaled to the panel that they were aware of issues raised by the reviewers and communicated to us that they were already involved in rethinking some aspects relating to structure, concepts, and scope. However, since the panel was committed to the framework of the review, it could not deviate from the 2015-2017 timeframe of the review. Thus, any amendments or changes made to the scope and concept of the journal could unfortunately not be factored into the final consensus review and the published version that appeared in May 2021, this year. I'm not suggesting that this, let's call it, time lag has anything to do with negligence on the part of anyone who was involved in the process. But as I said earlier, we noticed that there were some issues that had to be considered, and it's difficult to it was difficult to respond to all the comments made by editors when they pointed out that some of the changes that were suggested were already underway. Yeah, that's really all I want to say now. Last but not least, I would like to express my gratitude. Also, I'm confident on behalf of my colleagues on the panel for the journal editors' cooperation in the review, for their willingness to engage with a quite laborious process and with the occasional critical questions. We appreciated the time and hard work that they invested in the review, and we hope that the process will contribute to keeping South African scholarly journals relevant and exciting in an increasingly competitive national and international publishing environment.
By saying that I'm amazed at how many of the points made by Professor Dedering sound familiar and you will hear some of them repeated in this report on the review of education journals, which was published in 2020. But I'd like to start, if I may, with a brief set of observations about the context of education journals and the education discipline and research in general, if I may, because I think it does have some bearing on the observations that have been made by the panel. You know, but both the school and post-school systems of education in South Africa, and probably most, well, many other countries in the world, faced challenges that offer really rich opportunities for research. You know, with the exception of the privileged parts of the private education system in South Africa, both parts of the system are underfunded. They both have faced and they continue to face turbulence and violence, and both have to deal with the realities of high dropout and low success rates and related challenges. We reviewed 17 South African-based journals, those that form the education cluster, and interestingly enough, those 17 are a small part of the 300-odd South African journals. But the irony of the challenges that the sector faces is that these challenges provide real opportunities for researchers in the field to publish their findings across a wide range of subdisciplines within education. Some of these journals, unfortunately, have also to bear the not consistently fair challenge of low esteem for research in education that is prevalent in academia. It was something I was acutely aware of in my time in the United States. But it's in this context that these journals, the journals in this cluster operate, and in which the 2020 review, well, prior to that was conducted and then published. Now, the interesting thing about education, although it seems to be a single rather than a group of disciplines under a broad heading like humanities, of the 17, 8 were specialist journals, such as the South African Journal of Environmental Education or the South African Journal of Childhood Education, and many others, while the remaining 9 were all, and remain, to my knowledge, more general in nature. For example, the Journal of Education, the South African Journal of Education, the Journal of Education Studies, and so on. I think the work undertaken by the 3 members of the Academy staff, the 6 expert panel members, who were those directly involved with the journals being reviewed, of course, were not involved in any of the particular journals, so that they were genuinely independent. And then 53 expert journals, scholars, who we tried to ensure were not, as reviewers, involved in any of the journals they were asked to review. I was asked to chair the panel, and interestingly enough, when it was announced that that would be my job, a colleague from the University of Pretoria, where I was then based, said, "But how can you be chairing this? You're in education." And so I had to explain that my speciality of work was not education, and so I was considered to be an independent chair. Now, of the 17 journals, 3 were recommended for removal from the DHET list. 4 were conditionally accepted. And the recommendations for inclusion in SciELO noted that 5 were already on the platform, 3 were recommended, 3 were invited to join subject to the journals implementing an open access model, and 6 were not recommended for inclusion at this stage. The more general observations that emerged from the work of the panel started with the observation that the appointment of editors-in-chief and the duration of their terms of office was a problem. Many were appointed without the position having been advertised, or have indefinite terms of office. Some were appointed in-house by universities which also published the journals. And in 1 or 2 rare instances, the fields covered by the journals were problematic for themselves, as there are small numbers of academic scholars working in those areas. And so finding the right scholars to undertake senior editorial work for them was a constant challenge. For example, the Journal of Childhood Education. Now, these principles relating to the editors also applied, we noticed, to editorial and advisory boards, in addition to which greater institutional diversity is valued. It is also noted that in some rare instances, editors continue to publish in their own journals, something which many, including Johan Matona, pointed out is definitely not best practice. A surprising number of the journals had deficient editorial policies, or policies that were not made public on websites, for example. So it is very difficult for scholars wishing to submit material to those journals to know what the policy bases were in which they would be operating. On the other hand, it's important to say that a number of the journals reviewed were commended on their comprehensive and publicly stated editorial policies. As a previous document of this kind for a different disciplinary area, I should note, commented that there also seems to be a dialectical relation between the desire for greater international visibility and participation in international conversations, and a focus on a useful niche for the journal. And this observation applied equally for education journals. There was a constant tension between, in the better of those journals, between looking for international contributions, but not ignoring South African, the work of South African scholars. But 3 loosely related matters were common concerns. The first was the absence of what came to be referred to as additional or enriching materials, an absence of editorials in some cases, a lack of commentaries, no book reviews, and very few news and views items in a good number of these 17 journals. The second is that there was remarkably considerable variation in the quality of published articles, even within journals and even within the really good journals in this cluster. And there was also a need to develop and strengthen ways of encouraging and supporting young scholars and novice researchers to read local journals and publish them. And as the previous chair of the panel noted, for this to happen with some general exercise of energy without discouraging established scholars from publishing in those journals. While the 8 specialist journals worked specifically in their fields, the aims of the 9 general journals rather distressingly revealed a largely consistent common core, although they phrased their aims somewhat differently, slightly differently. They effectively were covering the same core of issues. In the Academy's report 12 years later, they noted that the country clearly has too many journal titles relative to the size of its scholarly base, at about 300 titles, each within 5 to 100 articles a year. The ratio of active journals researchers, about 24,000 to journal titles in the region of 1 to 180. So many of the review panels have recommended mergers between journals. This is the NSEF comment, covering the same ground, yet none has occurred. The panel also, in this case, reflected on the open access status of education journals. The review process actually revealed a variety of, and this is a critical point, of page and or article charges. And these ranged from close to zero, if not zero itself, to over 300,000, 3,000 Rand per article. Now, clearly there are many factors that account for these changes. Support from universities or scholarly societies, modes and costs of production, and levels of subscription fees, if any, and I'm sure there are others. But the sense of the panel members was that as this is also a matter of concern across the journal publishing spectrum, Kian, you'll be acutely aware of this, it's an issue that would best, we felt, be considered by the National Scholarly Editors Forum. Like the previous speaker, I'm personally very, very grateful to the panel members and who served to do this work and to manage it in terms of finding reviewers and putting together the comments of reviewers. And I would also like to comment on the fact that because of the nature of the discipline, a number are, well, when I say a number, Maputi can correct me, but I think at least 2 of the members of the panel changed jobs during the course of the review. And because of new levels of responsibility, had to stand down and then were replaced by panelists who joined somewhat after the beginning of the process. But in both cases, they quickly caught on to the requirements and undertook their work despite becoming relatively latecomers, did a wonderful job. I'd also like to thank Maputi and Susan for the tremendous support they provided. We simply couldn't have undertaken our work under the time pressures that were set and are required, obviously, in order to get through all the South African journals, without their help and the promptness of their responses. So my sincere gratitude to both the panel members and to the NSEF staff members. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Again, within time. Okay, let's move on then to the final session of this particular morning meeting, and that's questions and answers and discussion. I think I'd like to ask all the speakers to stay close and to address questions that might come up from the floor. I see that there are 2 on the chat list.
Kian, sorry, Susan speaking. Yes. Please, just to clarify sort of the mystery, and I think Maputi tried to say that, but she has a bad line, and that is just apologize. It's a mistake from our side that Professor Jonathan Jansen should not have been mentioned. That is what happens if you have multiple documents and you start copying and pasting, and that really slipped in, and I do want to apologize. And just to put him in the clear, it's not that he's not interested. It was really a mistake from our side. Thank you for allowing me. Thank you.
No, thank you. Jonathan is always larger than life, so we need to pay due deference.
I would also like to add, if I may, that this is a perfect excuse as to why Jonathan and I didn't talk about this.
Right. Okay. Okay. Thank you. All right. So I see there are two questions that have come up. I'm just trying to find the chat. The one is, if a journal is based at a university, what are the logistical implications if editors are located at other universities? From Elizabeth Henning, I think. Is that a... Suzanne, would you like to answer that question?
Kian, I did see that Prof Crew has started to answer that question. I wonder if we can give him an opportunity to perhaps respond. I know this is quite high on his agenda.
Okay, Robin.
In my answer, I indicated what some of the problems are. I mean, John has indicated that there are journals in education with overlapping mandates, and that actually occurs in a number of other disciplines. And NSEF has been suggesting for some time that a rationalization of journals with these overlapping mandates would be helpful in the sense of making them more viable and more impactful going into the future. So that's the one point. The second point is the question about the barrier to entry of new journals. Now, the thing is that if for a journal to actually be recognized, it has to establish a track record. And that's one of the DHET requirements. So there is a barrier to entry. You won't be recognized immediately. You have to have a couple of years of a track record in order to make an application. And in that respect, South African journals are no different to other journals which are established outside of the country, because many of those journals have no impact factor, and therefore there's a barrier to authors for publishing in those journals because of the rating mechanisms that are used. But if the editors and the initiators of the journal really believe that it has a niche and is likely to be successful in the future, then there's no reason why they shouldn't go ahead and give it a go. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. I think that's the point. Give it a go. If you want to stake your reputation on a new journal, take the hit for the first couple of years until it's recognized by either the DHET or the indexes, because they all have a delay. They all want to see the track record before they will actually either index or recognize. So I think we've answered the second question. Are there any other questions from anybody else?
I'm sorry, Kian, I see that there's a very important question by McClough Cole that asks, does it mean journal editors should never publish in their own journals, or is there a threshold of articles that can be published per year? I will go ahead and answer if that is okay with you, and we can have other comments. Thank you.
This is a matter that's come up repeatedly, but please do continue.
Yes, indeed. This is a very important question. I want to say Well, it doesn't mean that editors should never publish in their own journals, but there's a very fine line and a threshold, that borders on research integrity and ethics. And that is that editors should actually refrain to publish in their own journal. And if they do, there should be a very clear policy to indicate what is the process then should the editor wants to publish in its own journal. But in going forward, I think in our code of best practice, up to now, we have never explicitly stated against that. We said that authors within a journal that 2/3 should be outside a particular institution. We also said that the editorial advisory board, you can consider the editor as part of the editorial advisory board, should actually refrain, but otherwise it must be clearly stated in the policy. But I think we should start being very explicit about our ideas and the code for best practice of editors publishing in their own journals. Thank you, Kia.
Yes, thank you. I think these are issues that are going to, or criteria ratios that are going to differ from discipline to discipline and journal to journal. The issues come up largely in the context, particularly of open access publishing, where editors have used the additional space available to publish excessively in their own journals compared to other authors in that journal. Sometimes, as we've learned from the CREST studies on behalf of DHET, up to 15 times. 15 articles in the same number of the same journal by the editor. Now that clearly is what DHET is going to consider as misconduct, because it seems to become a cash mill through the DHET incentive for a particular editor or particular set of authors. We do need to understand also that journals help to shape disciplines. And if journals are shaping disciplines, who is doing the shaping? It's the editors who are facilitating particular kinds of debates through those pages. And certainly in my discipline, cultural media studies, the most influential journals did publish articles by their editors, but of course they went through the usual assessment criteria, and they didn't use the journals to milk any incentive systems, but in fact to shape the discipline. The question is, how does one monitor an over publication as opposed to a reasonable publication? So I think these are issues that we can certainly put on the agenda of the committee and have been on the agenda. But I think the initial issue is that, and I think you might see this tomorrow when the CREST material is presented, because in the last couple of meetings, Johan Mutan has actually identified the journals concerned and even the editors or the authors concerned. So it's a question of playing the game and being reasonable in terms of where one publishes. Certainly editors should be publishing as much as possible in other journals across the world rather than just in your own journal. So let's pick up this discussion tomorrow if it comes up again from CREST. Okay, there's a note here from Ureta Rosenberg. Our field is small, so we do have a wider international readership, 3,000 downloads in the publishing month. Well, that's information which indicates interest in that particular journal or that particular article. Are there any other questions?
I now wonder if you want to take the hands. There's one from Ada and one from Elizabeth.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I'm seeing that now. Okay. Ada Order.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so I made the comment on the ethics being noted, but it's important rather to make exceptions rather than to have a blanket rule, because any number of scenarios could emerge that would make it necessary or, even advisable for an editor to publish in their journal without, any monetary considerations being the motive. The example that we're facing now with our journal, the Journal of Comparative Law in Africa, is that our managing editor was also the recipient of a fellowship, a research fellowship that binds him to produce a piece of work and publish it in our journal. This fellowship was instituted at a time when he was not the editor, but now he happens to be a managing editor. He's a recipient of the fellowship. He is a fellow, and he has to publish his work in this journal. This is just one of any number of examples. So it would be problematic, I think, to place a blanket ban on it. I think it's something that needs to be discussed and carefully worded in a way that would not hinder other related research initiatives, such as this fellowship that I've just mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. I think flexibility should be the principle within appropriate guidelines. Okay, Elizabeth Henning. I see your hand is up. Elizabeth? Not coming through. Okay.
I have unmuted again, yes.
Okay, please go ahead.
Yes, this has to do with my first question in the chat box, and that is, if the editor of the journal is at the institution where the journal is based, and the editorship then moves to another institution, there are problems which we have encountered in that the institution, the primary institution or the first one, may wonder what will the standard of management be at the other institution? What guarantees are there that the journal will survive? And so at my university, there was a decision in the faculty where one journal is published that we would like to have new editors when they are ready and when they've been schooled well enough, but not to move it to other institutions where there is no guarantee that the management, which is quite vast, as you all know, will get the same attention. Do you have anything to say to that? And then just quickly, in terms of editors publishing in their own journals, it's one of the critiques we received in a review. When a journal is not yet accredited, we try and fill it up with quality articles as much as we can so that it can be accredited. And that also happens when an editor then feels, I've got to make my contribution as well. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to ask Robin to respond to the first question.
Thank you, Keenan. I'm not sure whether I have a response to the first part of the question, because it seems to me that the institution and the editorial board should have a role to play in the appointment of the editor. And in the process of appointing the editor, they should attempt to ensure that the editor will manage and foster the development of the journal adequately. And if that is the case, then I don't see that a particular institutional affiliation is necessarily definitive. But my feeling is that the institution that hosts or publishes the journal needs to participate in the process of the appointment of the editor, and I think that may address some of the difficulties. If you think about it from the point of view of commercial publishers, for instance, the commercial publishers obviously have a great deal of interest in who the editor of a journal that they own is going to be. And so there's always an interaction between the people in the discipline and the publisher about who the appropriate person is to become the editor of that journal. And I think that it's in that process that you attempt to protect both the journal and the publisher in that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Just remind us about the second point that you made?
Oh, it was just about editors donating their work before accreditation, just to get it going.
Well, I think that's the investment that we have to put into what we want to do. Otherwise, we're not going to actually be able to move through. Thank you. Okay.
I agree.
Question here from Neil Eccles about, I guess you're talking about article processing fees. This is something that's on the global agenda, particularly as we move from subscription-based reader pays through libraries to author pays to open access, and the fees go up dramatically. And who's actually paying for all of that? Well, that's a big debate that's going on at the moment. My immediate response in the current context would be that if you are publishing in an accredited journal, that journal, as you know, earns incentive for the university, and different universities disperse that money differently through different mechanisms. But it's the university that would have to be now approached to pay the page charges or the article processing fees, either directly if they put the money into an institutional pot, or the author removes it from their own DHET top slicing that goes into their research account. So there's always funding available to pay for article processing charges, either from the author direct or from the university. But we all know that universities can be difficult about creating central pots, although I think some are now doing that. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that particular explanation. Neil,
sorry, Kia, no, it's welcome. You can pass over to Neil. I'd like to respond at some time. Thank you.
Okay, Neil, your hand is up. Do you want to speak also?
Yeah, I mean, my question was almost, it was a wondering whether, you know, the institute or the sort of highly subsidized NSEF publication management software platform might not be a mechanism whereby some of those costs might be reduced. So if an organization such as NSEF could broaden the scope of you know, of those, what did I call them, sort of low publication fee journals, whether that might not allow us to be both open access and waive page fees, you know, and get the best of both worlds. So construct a social good space, I guess. Thanks.
Okay, Suzanne, did you want to reply?
Yes, thank you. So quite a number of issues have been raised. So the one is about what if the management of a journal is in one institution and the editor and associate editors and other works are with other institutions. I don't think that's a problem. I think it speaks to the issue of governance of a particular journal. And I think that's why we also try and encourage journals to really think about how do they govern their journal. I don't think there's anything wrong to stipulate that the management of a particular journal will be vested at a particular institution, and that the editors can then be appointed in a way that has been stated by that journal. We prefer competitively. And as Professor Crew has mentioned, he outlined a very specific process. So I think that is very important. If you think about the ASAF journal, so we manage the journal, but I mean, our editor, our associate editors are spread across sort of South Africa, and we function and we do it, but we are governed that way. And that is how we've set up the journal, and we're very upfront about what we do and what we don't do. So we're the title owner as well. So again, that speaks to governance. In terms of article processing charges, that's a major debate internationally. International publishing organizations actually levies quite large article processing charges for developing countries, which is highly problematic. And even in South Africa, if we think about the research funds that different researchers have, and how to pay out of that, that is very difficult. At a point, we did advocate for article processing charges to the Institute, that the Institute could make provision for that. And our reason for that position was that the subsidies get paid to the universities, not to individuals, but to universities, and that editors should actually make a case at the university management that some funding could then actually come to the journal, such to fund the journal. But that's a scenario which is very difficult because institutions do with that money is what they deem to be fit. And little of that money actually trickles down to the researcher themselves and to the research funds. We were at some stage, we were suggesting in both our reports that maybe the research output policy, that there should be a top slicing that should go to journal editors. I think that is still an idea that one could tell with, although it's very difficult to tap into top slicing into government funds. It's highly problematic. But I think what will be critical then for the national system of research output is to have a clear policy and journals of quality that sort of governs that fund as such. So I think South African journals in the entirety will have to move a long way to ensure that government funding, if it would ever be paid to article processing charges, will then be of journals of quality and of high standards. Thank you, Kian.
Okay, need to bring this to a close. There's just one final comment. Are there journals in South Africa that are classified as predatory? I think that's a question that will be answered tomorrow when Johan Matan and Chief talk about the quality assurance program. So let's deflect that till then. I just wanted to say that I was quite pleased to see that the 12 years later report authored by Wieland Gerwers was actually the number 4 on the readership stakes on the graph that we were shown earlier. I think that was an important study that we should all be reading in order to understand the context out of which we've come and into which we're actually moving. Things are moving so fast in the political economy of publishing across the world that it's sometimes quite difficult to keep up. But again, I would also refer all editors to the South African Journal of Science, which in recent years has been debating many of these issues in its own pages, in addition to those reports published by NSEF on its website, both as full research articles and as commentary. These are the contextual articles that underpin much of the discussions that are going on globally at the moment. I think that we've got a very short period for lunch, 15 minutes. Don't get indigestion. Please do refill and please do come back. I think there's a bit of a fun session after lunch. And then, of course, thereafter, we get back into the hard-nosed business. So thanks to everybody for participating, and do encourage your colleagues to join in and join the fun. Thank you.